We had one hour.
Yep.
They were super lucky to have Professor Menno Fenger's presentation.
Nobody said.
He's a visiting scholar for this semester that is flowing by. So if you haven't had if you haven't had the opportunity to meet him, please, reach out. Let's, as I said, we're very lucky to have him as a visiting scholar. He's an endowed professor of public administration at the Erasmus University, Rotterdam. He has been working for many years on public administration, implementation of policies. And let me see. He was also in 2006 a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. So hopefully this was not just your only view of the US, because it's been quite a semester, as I said.
It was the last time I was in the US, so almost 20 years ago.
Financial crisis, it was the Katrina financial crisis, definitely. He was also a senior policy advisor at the Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment between 2006 and 2008. And well, now he's part of the Department of Public Administration at the Erasmus University. So join me in welcoming Professor Menno.
Thank you so much. It's very nice to be here. Let's just get this thing started. So this is where I usually am, on the 17th floor. This is my window. So you can imagine, you cannot see my window from there, but you can imagine how nice it is to be at this inspiring workshop for this semester. We all, including my kids and my wife, we all had are having a wonderful experience, despite the political climate, which could have been a bit better, I think. Well, let's not delve into that. I think of course, I only have very brief time, but three things I would like to say up front. A bit of my personal background. I'm by training a policy scientist, which is something in between political science and public administration. And as you know, or perhaps don't know, Lynn Ostrom is among the most cited policy scientist scholars as well. We have a bibliometric overview out, which will be published in GCPA. Next year, in which we found that. So basically, I've come across Lynn's work for over 2 or 3 decades, but so a policy scientist by training, and then somehow got lost in the field of social policy, which is not an established academic discipline in the Netherlands, but it is in some Anglo-Saxon countries, for instance, in the UK. So I'm a social policy scholar in a public administration department right now. And I realized it must have been 30 years ago that I picked up a copy of Lynn's Rules, Games and Common Pool Resources book. So we're also celebrating my 30th anniversary of being engaged with the work of Lynn. And in what I'm doing today, and this broader project, is basically trying to connect these things, public policy, social policy, and Lynn Ostrom's work, in a project which I called Commoning the Welfare State. And this presentation is a bit, a couple of pieces from the jigsaw puzzle combined. I'm trying to fit in everything in an overall framework that makes sense. And basically what I'm trying to do today is test out if it makes some sense. So there are kind of pieces that I'm interested in. I have been interested in for a couple of decades already, and I'm trying to fit them in such a way that it's a coherent narrative, and up to you to judge basically that. So that if you have any feedback, basically give me feedback on this is a convincing story or not. So what I would like to do today is first having a very small nutshell-like argument about why and how we should come on the welfare state. And then I also delve into this conceptual issues of what is commoning and what is the welfare state. Then I'll be extending the argument on a broader, more abstract scale. And then finally, I'll end up with some research questions and next steps. So it's not one of these presentations in which I have a finished paper and I'd like to have your comments. It is basically trying to find out if this is an interesting idea that we could delve upon. So I don't think any of you have had the pleasure of eating at Wout's restaurant in the beautiful town of Moergestel, the Netherlands. I'm safe to assume that. I have to admit, me neither, but it makes for a nice story. So this is a nice story, and as you may guess, this is Wout. Wout's the owner of the restaurant at Wout's. And just like in the Netherlands, just like in the US, I think. Let's start a different. Wout is very sportive, active guy. He plays padel, which is more or less in between squash and pickleball. And he got injured playing padel. Here comes the welfare state part of the story. Just like in the US, I think when you get injured in the Netherlands and you own your own business or you're self-employed, there's nothing to fall back upon. If you get sick in the Netherlands as an employer, as an employee, life is wonderful. You can stay at home up till 2 years, 100% of your salary covered. If you're employed, if you're not an employee, you don't have an employer, no one will pay for you. You're totally on your own. So when Wout got injured, he had a problem, but luckily he was smart enough to join the so-called bread fund in the Netherlands. I'll sit, otherwise I'm still. And the bread fund is a voluntary mutual, call it insurance if you like, but it's not a proper insurance for people who are not covered by sickness benefits. So it's a mutual voluntary thing. For entrepreneurs or self-employed people, it gives you an allowance in case of sickness. There are 20 to 50 participants in such a bread fund. They contribute monthly part of their income, and there's a monthly governance meeting for all participants. So they get together. It's kind of a nice social gathering because a lot of these people are self-employed, don't see other co-workers in the office. So it's also kind of a social outing, and it's discussing how things are with this bread fund. And in case of sickness, like Wout, you get a monthly allowance based on contribution up to 2 years, more or less similar. And participants decide what happens after these 2 years. So they may kick you out, they may force you to take up another business, whatever they like, it's up to them. And well, full stop, I think. So I think you can feel coming that this is similar to what Lynn would call a common pool resource. At least that was what I was expecting. So we have the basic table that we all know by heart. We have total goods, public goods, private goods, common pool resources. And when starting this project, my first question was, can we consider the welfare state as a common pool resource or not? I think that was what I worked on the first couple of weeks when I came here. I think it's quite easy to say that these funds are subtractable. If you get money, I don't get it. So we could easily forget this, thereby ignoring a large part of economic literature on the welfare state. There are quite a few economists claiming that the welfare state is a more or less public good. But if we start from this small scale example, we could ignore that, claiming that we end up here. So then we have either private goods or common pool resources. Would we be able to call this a private good or a common pool resource? So depends on the question. Can we exclude potential beneficiaries or not? And I think here it becomes interesting, and this is my first conceptual innovation, if I could claim that. This forces us to dive a bit deeper in what Lynn would have called, in how Lynn defines excludability. So she claims in her 2005 institutional variety book, but also on other spots, that excludability is connected to the possibility of excluding participants that do not contribute to the availability of or maintenance of the common pool resource. In this definition, and I think that's the only thing she comes up with, in this definition, she looks to it from a contributor's perspective. Can we exclude people that do not contribute good enough? But a lot of her work is also about appropriation, a lobster fishery, irrigation, lobster fishery, trees, fisheries more in general, and so on. So here, this potential to contribute is not as important, I would say, the lobsters are there. The only thing that is excludable is exclusion of participants that take more than their fair share. That's what you do that's what you exclude in lobster fishery, but also in other type in forestry, for instance. So I would say that a small amendment of Lynn's work towards excluding people that are taking more than their fair share makes it possible to conceive the welfare state as a common pool resource. The potential of excluding people to take more than a fair share or not makes it a common pool resource. And my answer to the question, is the welfare state a common pool resource, would be yes, it is, because we have a hard time preventing people to take up more than their fair share if they are eligible. So you could claim that you're sick. While you're not sick, go on holiday to Ibiza or France or whatever, and have the mutuality pay for it. Nothing to be done about it, apart from finding ways of control, like Lynn would suggest. So you're with me on this? I think my first conclusion, I see a lot of people nodding, my first conclusion is yes, it is possible. It needs some conceptual flexibility, but it is possible to conceive this kind of mutualities as elements of a common pool resource. Okay, next step. If this is a common pool resource, then we might be able to model it in, if this is a common pool resource, then we could indeed use Lynn's work. And then I would say these are two interconnected games, as you would call it. So on the one hand, you have these people providing, on the other hand, you have people appropriating, and together they sustain this common pool resource, which is a second conceptual innovation, still fits quite neatly in the work of Ostrom. But we have people providing, we have people appropriating, and in the case of this mutuality, they are the same people, more or less. But in other cases, there might be a bigger distance, but still, I feel that this model works more or less for me. To dive into it more deeply, if you ask me to. Well, next step. If this is the case, if this works, then we might be able to model this in an agent-based model. So here we have squares are people who might contribute or not. Circles are people who might take up a benefit, who are eligible for a benefit. And I did some modeling in which people voluntarily contribute to this system, or more or less voluntarily. So 45% of the people more or less voluntarily contribute to the system. If a volunteer contributor comes upon another square, and other people with income, he checks if it's a contributor or not. If it's not a contributor, he feels shocked and say, well, I'm not going to contribute for the next 3 times, and so on and so forth. And my aim with this is trying to create a sustainable model, which allows me in the later stage of the research to add some fun things in. But the question is, are we able to collect a sustainable model? And well, I only have it run for 8 times, but look at this. You see that this is how much there's in the common pool, and each tick, so each year, if you like, people subtract from it, people contribute to it, and it will become a more or less sustainable model. The red dots are people who are taking more than their fair share. They're taking up a higher benefit they're allowed to, and if they meet someone else, it's disclosed what they're doing. We could go into the details of the model later. I have a final slide as an appendix if you want to ask questions about it. But take it from me, this is a sustainable model right now, which is nice because it gives me the opportunity to model some of the things Lynn would do in these kinds of models. So we could create more distance between the squares, giving less information about how others act, and therefore more or less removing the sustainability of the model. I've not come to that. I'm only here for a couple of months, but for now, I'm happy with the fact that I created a sustainable model. Okay, next step. We had Wout, the guy with the restaurant, in his mutual bread fund. Everyone's happy in that bread fund. But government is not happy, because government is afraid that this voluntarily take up of sickness benefits of mutualities leave some people out, leave some people unprotected. So what Dutch government wants is create an obligatory scheme for people for all people, also self-employed business owners and so on. We have an obligatory scheme for employees. The Dutch system, the Dutch government would like to have a system for all, a universal sickness system. And I'm not sure if you can guess what this voluntarily mutuality people think of this, but surprisingly enough, they want to keep their bread fund. They're not happy with the idea that it's becoming universal, and the arguments in a Twitter campaign or an X campaign are much about trust and solidarity. So I specifically like this one. It is not just about money. It is and remains heartwarming to be able to support each other without fuss and overhead. And I'm not sure how well you are into Lynn's work, but this is typically what she would call crowding out. So crowding out the responsibility of the participants by introducing hierarchical steering or hierarchical governance. And why do we crowd out? Why do we think it's necessary? Because Dutch government and most other instances think that the model of rational behavior underlies lots of the behavior. And because not everyone is capable of organizing in mutualities, we need to have a government safeguarding the social protection of all people. Which leads to, as he said, in some settings, particularly in those where individuals lose a sense of control of their own fate, providing external inducements to contribute may produce counter-intentional consequences. And external intentions may crowd out behaviors that are based on intrinsic preferences. So Lynn would have doubted if it would be a good idea to transfer the responsibility for this sickness insurance scheme from the mutuality, the common ownership, towards a universal national scheme. And I think she would have loved to continue organizing it in such polycentric circles as it is organized today. So what if Lynn was right? What if these mutual insurances are a good way to organize elements of social protection that would allow us to extend the argument beyond this simple mutuality to continue to a larger scale, let's call it the welfare state, with several different policy domains: unemployment benefits, pensions, social assistance, social housing, education, healthcare. And each of these, of course, has its own specific characteristics. Each of it has its own specific attributes. But it might be nice to explore what happens, or perhaps also explore if it is even possible to introduce some of the elements that we've seen in my example of common ownership in this bread fund into these large-scale programs of the welfare state. And that is necessary because our current welfare states, specifically in Europe, but also in the US, are dominated by lack of trust. By lack of trust from government in its participants. You have had Elon Musk going through the Social Security files because he does not trust the people who claim Social Security. He assumes that they're taking up more than their fair share. And we knew from Lynn's work that intrinsic motivation might also help preventing people from taking more than their fair share. In the Netherlands, we had a very large-scale scandal in which also the Rutte government needed to resign. It's called the childcare allowance scandal. The Australians had the Robodebt thing. There's something in the UK, there's something in Norway, and it all revolves around the same issue. The government does not trust its citizens. The other way around, indeed, citizens cannot be trusted. There is a large amount, at least a significant amount of fraud in these social insurance schemes, in these social protection schemes. But back again to Lynn's work, if we would be able to give people both providers and appropriators more responsibility, they might also act more responsible, because that's what I learned from Lynn. If you take away responsibility from people, they will behave irresponsible. If we give people responsibility, they will behave responsible. At least that's her hypothesis, which has been confirmed in quite a lot of research settings. It's not always true. There are specific conditions in which this applies, but it might be nice to explore what happens if we would be able to give people more responsibility in this scheme. So that's what we're about to do. So building block 3 or jigsaw puzzle piece 3, the current welfare systems have become designed to combat free riding. Compulsory contributions which break the connection between contribution and use of this common pool resource. Extensive monitoring and control of benefit recipients to combat fraud. We call it the surveillance welfare state. And finally, conditionality to ensure quick and intensive job search. We do not trust people who receive an unemployment benefit to find a job on their own. It's lazy people who will not go out there look for a job if we do not force them to. It's what this conditionality assumes. But I'm not sure if any of you know someone receiving unemployment benefits. All the people I know, I've come across quite a lot of them, are looking for jobs. And they're not looking for jobs because government wants them to. They're looking for jobs because they want a job. They think it's a good way to fulfill their goal in life. They think it's a nice way to earn income. You get to see some people every now and then. Coffee might be nice. So there are millions of reasons to take up a job, apart from the government forcing you to take up a job. And the other way around. If I have a vacancy, I get at least 10 applications from people who are forced by government to apply for a job. And I can see that in the letter from the first note, because there's usually a typo in the first letter, in the first sentence, preventing me, but also for them, making sure that they will not get interviewed. Because the worst things that I could think of is getting interviewed. They only do that to comply for their obligations. So I think, again, back to Lynn would say all these policies are based on a single model of rational behavior, which presumes short-term, self-interested pursuit of material outcomes as the only mode of behavior adopted by individuals. And we know that's not true. We know that's not true in the small-scale setting of mutualities, but we also know that's not true from real-life examples. And I'll walk you through 3 examples. First one is GoFundMe. I'm not sure if you know the website. It is full of individuals wanting to get funded for something. Here we have Fasle. Fasle's car broke down, and he needs his car to deliver meals. And Fasle simply put on this GoFundMe website, please give me money to fix my car. Well, not a single rational egoist would give Fasle money to fix his car. But, and it's quite, I created a couple of days ago, so I'm not sure what it is now. It was up only then, but $165 raised. So if we want confirmation of the fact that there's other behavior than rational egoistic behavior, here it is. There's just people without any reason, not knowing Fasle, just transferring money to him. It's only small amounts. It's only $25 or $10. But people are behaving not only because of self-interest. Larger. In Berlin, we had a large-scale basic income. Continue our talk, yeah. In Berlin, we had a large-scale basic income experiment. And of course, I'm not trying to propagate basic income. That's another discussion. But what's interesting in that specific case is that people voluntarily contributed to this experiment. So it was not government-induced, government-funded. No, it were voluntary people who gave money to run a basic income experiment, giving 3,000 Berliners €1,000 a month for 2 years. Not one, not two, not 7. Almost 200,000 people voluntarily contributed to this. So again, if we want proof that there's other behavior even in the welfare state than only self-interest behavior, here it is. And then finally, give directly. I think you might have heard it because it's a US company. I've had a nice email conversation with the CEO of it. They're providing basic income to people in mainly in Africa and specifically in Kenya and other countries. And they have large ambitions. So they wanted to raise $50 million, again, in voluntary contributions. Now, if you go to give directly, you could just give some money, and then it will be transferred to people in African countries, giving them a basic income each month. And again, people do it all the time. And what's nice, if you donate to Give Directly, you'll get this email also quite a few months later of what happened to your money. Not general, abstract, but very close. So we know that Jennifer and Zakio received some of the $50 I paid. And of course, it's fake, or perhaps it's not fully fake, but it's stylized. But here they also explain what they did with this money. So what's happening here is not only that people voluntarily contribute, but they also clearly see what happened to the money they contributed. So they're being held accountable. The people who receive the money are accountable and are giving accountability. So from these three simple examples, I'll take away behavior is much more varied than only rational egoistic, shown that. Second, in the examples I gave, a connection between contributors and recipients is created, although the intensity varies. So I showed you my very complex picture of the appropriation game and the provision game. And what happens in these mechanisms, in the examples I gave you, is that these people interact. Indirectly, perhaps, there is some interaction. 3, digital technology facilitates this collection and transfer of funds and the connection between contributor and recipient. Governance is non-state or polycentric. There are clear rules. The IAD framework could easily be applied to identify each of these rules. And trust is important. Trust in the platform, trust in the ideological goal, and trust in the recipient, which is 100% different of the government that does not trust its citizens and the citizens that do not act responsibly. So it would be so nice if we could try to turn this whole narrative around and introduce some of the elements that we learned from Lynn and that we can clearly see in each of these examples, or reintroduce them into these welfare state provisions that, of which most started also in a mutual way. So my aim, my goal of the project I'm pursuing is commoning, let's say, reintroducing elements of self-management in systems that are dominated by hierarchical governance. So if Ostrom is right about the impact of crowding out, what would happen if we would crowd in, if we would do the opposite, if we would reintroduce elements of common governance and not as a panacea? I'm not sure if Mike McInnes is online. I know he has this critical stance about the commoners, seeing them as left radicals, but not as a panacea, but as a way to empirically test this crowding in hypothesis. If we would be able to find some settings in which we would crowd in, we could see what happens and see if indeed trust is reinstalled, indeed see if people are behaving more responsible. And I think this fits very nice with the framework that Lynn, in her Institutional Variety book, claims. She gave us some questions that guide this kind of analysis. So clarify the relationship between contribution and benefit, enhance participation, design sanctions that fit and that distinguish between someone making an error or real bad behavior, and so on and so forth. So these are the questions that C already gave to us. So it's not so hard to imagine that we apply these questions in a setting, like I said. So what I'm trying to basically say here is that I think Lynn would have wanted us to also include the how. And my research focuses not only on the why of these commoning the welfare state, but also on the how of the welfare, on the governance of welfare state. So why are some common pool resources more sustainable than others? A typical Lynn Ostrom question is a question that we could also ask for welfare state provisions. Why is the Berlin basic income example so sustainable? Why is the give directly example so sustainable? And why are other systems not so sustainable? So my research agenda first is studying cases of welfare state commoning in action, including a typology. And I have created typology, but I don't have time for it. So if you want to know more, ask it. There's a slide after the end. Second, are we able to do this? Could we indeed common governance in these formalized settings? And Lynn herself already comes up with what she called modest coping mechanisms to combat tendencies of institutions becoming too hierarchical. I think we need a bit more. So I would say design features for commoning governance would be a really nice way to go forward. Trying to identify which barriers and coping mechanisms there are, not only in real life, but also in the agent-based model I showed you, and doing design-oriented research, trying to find out what's needed to actually do this. That brings me to my next steps. So we had Diana was somehow involved in the academic board, in the advisory board. We had a proposal rejected on commoning governance for the Data Science Foundation, but we'll try again for the EU Horizon thing. It was a nice outlet, but there's one incredibly nice outcome of that. I showed you that the Dutch childcare allowances system is the symbol of everything that was wrong in the way Dutch government treated its citizens. And we'll get the opportunity to have someone on board when they're reforming the system. So he will be doing ethnographic research, assisting them in redesigning the system, and basically trying to find out what is needed to introduce elements of commoning, because he's under my supervision, in this new system. And what barriers he will come across. So that's really cool, a really cool outcome anyway. And then I'm working a bit old-fashioned on a monography called Commoning the Welfare State, which I would like to have finished by the end of next year. And I think I'm writing chapters for that now. Then for the workshop, what I would like you to take up on, or challenge you to take up on, is this idea of transformation also as an element that is something the workshop could work on. So not only analyzing things as they are, but trying to find out what is needed to introduce elements of commoning in existing institutions. So crowding in as one of the goals of the workshop, reconnecting institutions and society, identifying strategies and uncovering barriers. And this is not only, I think, feasible in the welfare state, but some of the problems your country is in is also connected to the lack of connection between the institutions, like an independent judicial system, and its citizens. We have forgotten what they're there for. There's no connection between them, and therefore we don't trust them anymore. So as a one-line, as Lynn showed us the why some commoning initiatives are more sustainable than others. Let's also focus on how can we make some commoning, how can we introduce commoning in systems that are clearly not sustainable. And that would mean systematically analyze strategies for commoning and their impact. So, happy for you to take your comments, browse you into.
Thank you for your patience.
Can I go?
Yes, go.
No, I know we've talked about some of this before, and as going through it again, my head is spinning with a lot of questions. I'm not sure I can't get it. Just go back though to the fundamental ideas of this rival and excludability. your example of the, I'm not sure exactly what you call the group that the employers group, the owners.
Yeah.
In many ways, it sounds more like a club good.
Mm.
And the reason I say that is, so in experiments, so there's a couple of things I'll blend here. Those the experiments we ran with Len and others as well. We look at public good games and we look at common pool resource games. And a couple of things come out. These are the same people, same population, and many times the same people. And we find high overuse of the common. We find destruction of the commons. And yet in the same sense, we find the same people providing a public good. Not that everybody's cooperative at the same level and these sorts of things. So in my mind, one of the things we showed early on is if you let these people communicate in a common pool resource setting or public goods, they start to cooperate. But the difference with common pool resources is that outsider that can come in and take the rents. One of the most interesting experiments was when we had insiders and outsiders. When you only have the insiders, there are no outsiders. And this is a common pool resource environment. There's rents to take away. You still could. They cooperate very well. You have these outsiders that can come in and take them. Everything falls apart, including these insiders cheating on each other. But I think in your example, the
bread fund.
the red fund, thank you, I was trying to, it sounds to me a lot like a country club or other type of situation where you're providing a resource to those who want to join. They pay fees and you control to what extent who can come in and who can't. So you can control the use of the resource. So you don't have overuse. That's at least one reason, overuse of the resource. So it's in that sense.
Yeah, but if we go back, I to some extent I agree with you. But if we go back to this definition, tall goods or club goods are non-subtractable. Netflix is a club good.
No,
I can watch Netflix.
in fact, I just taught this yesterday. So I always think of these things, and this is from discussions with Lynn as well. And Lynn, it's my understanding is Lynn, Vincent, Scott Gordon, and a few of these others were they were probably the people that sort of came up with this way of organizing this. So, but I teach it as being, this isn't yes or no, this is varying these things. They all move in different directions, depending on what degree of subtractability you have, what degree of excludability you have. So you got to sort of move in those directions, right? So I don't think, I don't even like the term toll goods. I like club goods better because I think it captures this idea of people coming together to create something, okay? And they can manage the club itself. Okay? They have property rights to that club that the government has actually given them. And in your case, that's an interesting question. Does the bread fund have property rights to those funds? So if I was an outsider, could I just come in and take those funds? And I doubt that I could.
No, you can't, but there's no way to check if you're taking up your allowance rightfully or not, because you could act as if you were sick or not. And I think that's where this subtractability element becomes important.
Guessing in a lot of club situations, you have those people that don't follow the rules in some sense. So yeah, that's part of it. I'm just saying these things are not.
Okay, agree.
There's somewhere in between these things, the tension is there. You know, the other thing I was thinking about is, I don't think I've thought about this before, is what is the government? And I think the government, in a sense, is a taker in many ways. And they may say that the reason we have these taxes, the reason we have these other things is we need to provide these public goods because otherwise they won't be provided in some sense. Probably true to some extent, but they create these rents that are there for government people, whoever those are in some cases, to take those rents. Okay, finally, one last point. Education. I think, at least the US, I think, provides this great example right now of education. The public education was created in the US years ago because of a problem of you wanted to have an educated group across the group. And so now what we see for this goes on for decades and decades and decades. Now you have this growth in charter schools. And now this government has taken the role of, let's take part of those public funds and give them to the charter schools. So you're sort of finding this unwinding. It's almost, to me, it's similar to what you're talking about, is that the government in the Netherlands doesn't like the bread fund.
Mhm.
In a sense, there's nothing wrong with forming charter schools. I mean, showing up biases. There's nothing wrong with this. But when you start then taking the public funds to support those, then you're moving in this direction of unraveling the whole idea of the government providing a public good, which is education. So there, I'll shut up. So there's a lot there, but there's a lot going on here.
Yes.
It's a fascinating idea, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of dimensions going on.
Yeah, so I think towards your final question, education is interesting as well. I think suitability varies between these different programs. So the suitability of my idea of commoning varies across different programs. I come from social assistance basically and unemployment benefits. That's where my expertise primarily lies. Pensions are totally different. People tend to just save money for their pensions in one way or another. So that's more like towards private goods. I think education is an interesting example, specifically from a Dutch perspective. We come from a history in which we have three kinds of schools: public schools, Catholic schools, and Protestant schools, and they were treated exactly the same way. So if a window would break in the public school and 10 euros would be invested to fix that window, both Protestant and Catholic school, even though the window was not broken, would get these 10 euros as well from tax money. So there we had a totally different mode of dealing with these charter schools. They're just basically provided by tax as well. So the discussion for me is somewhat difficult to understand in the US, because on the one hand, I love public schools. On the other hand, I think the Dutch system, in which you just give everything times three gymnastic schools, 3 buildings even on the same street next to each other, is also a way to deal with that. So that's
Well, just one point on this. Actually, my 7th grade granddaughter
yeah, I know.
had to have she had to respond to questions related to this in a part of her class. And we started talking about it. And I said, but one thing that's happening here is you've got to remember, public schools have a responsibility to educate all children. And that includes children with disabilities and these other things. And charter schools don't necessarily. And so this is when some of these,
Okay.
some of your views on these things start to.
Yeah, and that's, in the Netherlands, that would be eligibility and obligations are same. So all schools need to educate all people as well. Your second point.
Makes a lot of points there.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'll just have another meeting and another coffee to. Your
Lynn would have said, in terms of the commons, a lot of it had to do with, can you form some sense of excludability? Can you start to, and I mean, because that was part of what she did. The research was about commons. She'd find these examples, including, I think her thesis was along these lines, over the sense of overuse of water in the Southwest. But it was, can these people come to and find agreement solutions that they can work together, and then can you prohibit the extraction of those rents that are created in the process?
One final, then we can move on. One final argument. So, I like the idea of lobster fishery, because I think it resembles much of this. So, who is eligible of fishing the lobsters?
Well, in fact, the experiment I told you about earlier, the thought of doing that was because of a graduate student who had family who were lobster fishermen or closely connected. And the problem the lobster fishermen had was they would come up with these agreements, but the outside, and often tourists, locals would come in and create the problem. So,
So it's fluid, let's say, excludability, and I think that's also what we have here. So once you're eligible, there is an opportunity for you to take more than your fair share. But well, I think we need to just continue that discussion with a nice coffee.
Keeping an eye on mine too.
Me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm Casey Kim. And
I should say, one of our new postdocs joining the workshop this fall for tech governance. Casey, we're so pumped.
Thank
Please.
you. It's very interesting because, especially, my PhD is public administration and policy. I'm from University of Georgia. So, So, there are reasons why the bureaucratic structures and the seem fine polycentric. So for your, Ostrom is rather polycentric, but at the same time, the university itself is bureaucratic. And then institutional economists argue there are reasons like transaction cost is like optimized sometimes even in a bureaucratic situation. So the point is, that's why I'm very interested in like reconciling those two different dimensions. And then, so my question goes to like, crowding out and crowding in. And then, you talked about accountability, but in a public bureaucratic context, accountability goes to, abidance by laws. Because in the democratic context, the accountable bureaucracy means the constitution control over the bureaucracy. So that goes to the abidance by laws. So I'm curious, how do you see the fundamental mechanism of connecting the crowding out and crowding in of the bureaucratic structure, which goes to the abidance by law into sort of polycentric, which doesn't really emphasize the context. So how do you really see that mechanism?
Very nice question. Thanks a lot. I think it is not, and that's typically Ostromian. I think it's not one or the other. But I think what's really nice from the examples I showed you is that there's also accountability from recipients directly to providers. I think parallel to or in alternative to these bureaucratic mechanisms which do not speak to ordinary citizens. It is Washington or Brussels or The Hague in my case, and that's what alienates people from the institutions they are providing money for. So if we somehow could see that people actually got a better life because the 45% of tax I paid this month, then we would have a totally different, I think, view of the tax money than if I see the annual budget, IRS, and so on thing. So it's different ways of accountability which should coexist, but the warm one, the let's say direct one, gives incentives to trust people, whereas what governments do is controlling and perceiving people as fraudsters. And if you say we need to control these people because they will combat fraud, then it signals the message they actually combat fraud. And if you look for it, you will find it. If the signal is these people are well-willing people who are trying to find a job and make a mistake every now and then, and you actually get messages that confirm that point of view, you have a totally different way of looking at people. And I think so. It's not one or the other, but I think it is kind of a different quality of accountability. And these direct accountability mechanisms might repair some of the mistrust that citizens have among themselves and that government seems to have in citizens.
That's great.
It's not the case anymore, but 10 years ago, the most trusted organization in the Netherlands was the tax authority. I know you see at least US people see people as legalized robbery, but in the Netherlands we until the Stratcar allowance scandal we loved taxpaying. We thought it was a very useful organization which did what it should do, and that has to do something with it started from trust, and now it's turned its way around and started to try and find fraudsters, and we ended up with a government resigning and so on. So it is a nice question and something to think. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up comment on the trust part. So because my specific research area is a human AI interaction, and you talked about the Dutch scandal stuff, and I know that because the part of the scandal was the human AI interaction issues. I mean, the humans were not really recognizing the autonomy comes from AI systems, and they were kind of relying on the system and that which went to some sort of catastrophic outcomes. So based upon that kind of phenomena or dynamics between humans and AI systems, that typically impacts those perceptions of human personnel when it comes to interacting with AI system. So I'm just adding additional thought, like you might need to consider that factor as well when it comes to talking about the trust really dynamics. And
Yeah, that's indeed in I think in all crises there was some kind of, it was not really AI but more algorithms and algorithms that were discriminatory. So they started with back names, for instance, Moroccan and Turkish back names were family names was what they started with. But indeed it's something to take into account as well. But you could also say algorithms or AI are forms of not of cold accountability. So they're more or less formalizing this accountability rather than the warm, direct accountability that we saw. So I agree that it's something to look into, but I would place it in the same more or less hierarchical way of governance rather than this mutual collaborative way of it.
Thank you for the presentation. So I was very interested in that bread
Fund,
bread fund initiative. So my question is, like, I have two questions. One is like, as Eleanor Ostrom mentioned, like design principle, it's not always the same combination, it's always different combination. So in your research, did you find differences between these different, like the way I understand is these are like mutual aid groups. So all these groups, do they have differences in terms of combination of these design principles, like the rules in use, like formal or informal, which are very intricate and might be very unique to a particular group? So were there differences between these different groups that made them sustainable in their own way? And the second question is, like, when the state Dutch government tried to make it formal, like the welfare scheme, why was it rejected by people or it failed due to their government's effort to standardize these rules, which are not necessarily similar for or applicable for all groups or everyone?
So it's also a nice set of questions. I think there are a lot of different initiatives. The Bread Fund is some kind of a national brand in which you could have local brands and they'll provide you with some national templates for how to organize, but that might be adapted to specific circumstances. So Jimmy and I had this nice talk. There was usually these are high-skilled professionals, so a restaurant owner or people doing freelance editing work and so on and so forth. There was this case of a bread fund in which a self-employed window cleaner wanted to join. And that window cleaning is kind of a dangerous job, specifically if you need to climb up ladders, go high. So that initiated discussions on what kind of requirements they could ask from this window cleaner to make sure that he did his work in a safe way. And did they wanted to check if they, so that kind of triggered this discussion and they allowed him in, and I think more or less based on trust. But indeed, so it is possible to adapt it to a local situation, but there's kind of a national template by the brand organization that provides a more or less overall scheme. But there are also parallel funds that do not adhere to this national template and just are go alone things. So there's a lot of variety, and they're more or less locally, they're adapted to local conditions. So which kind of jobs and so on and so forth. And indeed, the IAD framework might be very nice to see which one's more sustainable than the other, to have more detail. I did not go into that deep. They just exist. They fit my overall idea of being common pool managed. Then your second question, I forgot about.
Government welfare scheme. Why didn't
it's so there is obviously, I think in your country as well as in my country, a lot of schemes initiated from the non-profit sector. So they started as more or less mutual schemes, but there were reasons to upscale them because they seemed not sustainable. For instance, an unemployment scheme for people in graphic design. My mother used to work as a layout, I think that's called. So she made the layout covers for newspapers by hand with tapes and so on and so forth. She got computerized, so she was not needed anymore. And if that would have been a scheme for people in graphic professions only, then it would have been bankrupt within no time. So it's obviously that risk sharing at the large scale level is sometimes a good idea. And that's where we or governments chose to upscale and make these schemes universal. And I think in that process, we lost some of the trust that I showed you in my presentation. So there's, of course, good reasons to make these things universal. Health insurance is sustainable as long as it's universal. If people can opt out of health insurance schemes, then they're not sustainable anymore because people who don't have health issues will opt out. So it is very good to have universal coverage, but you lose something of the trust-related crowding in intrinsic motivations if you do that. So I'm trying to find that balance, and that's what these people try to find. They were not exactly opposed to the idea of making it more universal. I think on the opposite, people have cried out and begged for universal sickness schemes for ages, also for people who are self-employed or own the business. But they found a solution that worked for them, and now they have the solution. They also see the benefits of that solution. So it's a delicate play of the pros and cons of universal versus fragmented coverage. And I think that's where my research is situated in. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think you perfectly see the dilemma or the tensions. And that's why it would be so nice to just try to find some settings in which we could try what happens rather than only being forced to rely on agent-based models and before and after kind of initiatives.
Menno, I would like to ask you a question about trust, because it seems that trust is very important for the BEP fund and other self-governing organizations. So I would like to know what are the mechanisms that can maintain or enhance the trust in those organizations. One thing I know is about the size. You mentioned about the BEP fund only 50 or 60 people. So will size or the background transparency be relevant to enhance the trust and operation of those organizations?
Yeah. Very nice question. I think the example of Give Directly, so the US organization that funds basic income in Africa, shows that size is not the issue here. So this is an enormous scheme. It has even larger goals, not helped by the current government, but it has enormous ambitions of just banning poverty out of Africa. That's their ultimate goal. So it's not size, but it is, I think in this specific case, it's all about communication. So the ability to, and the fact that people trust this communication so that it is indeed authentic people that have received your money and that should be able to, and that you could indeed trace the money. So I think this communication between what is done with the money and who gave the money is essential in this kind of examples. And then, of course, there are other mechanisms for trust in organizations like professionalism, accountability, and so on and so forth. But in my specific examples, I think this provider-beneficiary relation and the direct communication between the two is what makes trust. Some of my research also was about personal interaction between government officials and beneficiaries. So when you get a social assistance benefit, usually you just get €1,000 a month and you do everything online. I ran some experiments in several municipalities in which these people were forced to come to the municipality's office 4 times a year. Just have a talk. How's life for you? What's good? What's wrong? What could we do for you? How are you? Basically, asking the question, how are you? And that created much more trust. And indeed, people did find jobs because we asked them, how are you? Rather than forcing them to fill in online forms. So that's kind of a weird mechanism that's much more emotional and much more indirect. But typically, I think in the heart of Lynn Ostrom's work as well. So this whole idea of emotional involvement, intrinsic motivation is for her was very important. I think that we could indeed trace that back in some of these personal contact experiments that we did.
it made me think of Colombia. One of the propositions of the Ministry of Equality is to give a universal basic income to everybody. So you don't have fraud, you don't have free riders. It's like, no, it's just, your income for existing pretty much.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I know we're running out of time, but thank you so much, man, for your presentation. Thank
So
you
true.
again for being here also.
Right?